There was once a man named Antonio who lived in a quiet little village, surrounded by rolling fields and whispering winds. On the outside, life seemed simple and peaceful. But inside Antonio's heart, there was a storm. Each morning began with a sigh and a furrowed brow. The smallest things at home, an unwashed cup, a late breakfast, a misplaced sock, could ignite his temper like dry grass in summer heat. His voice, once gentle, had become sharp. His eyes, once kind, had become tired and wary. At work in the small metal workshop, he could not tolerate mistakes. A wrong measurement, a tool left out of place, and he would lash out at his coworkers with cutting words. They began to avoid him not out of hatred, but out of fear, and when evening came and the stars began to scatter across the sky, even then he found no peace. The barking of a dog, a neighbor's laughter, the creak of a wooden door, all became reasons to grumble, to argue, to blame. What Antonio didn't realize was that he had built a prison, not of stone or steel, but of his own anger. Day by day, wall by wall, he had locked himself away. He believed others were the problem, his wife, his children, his co-workers, the world. But he never turned inward to look at the source of his suffering. The truth is, dear friend, when anger takes root in the heart, it clouds our vision. It makes enemies out of loved ones. It turns small discomforts into unbearable burdens. And worst of all, it fools us into thinking we are always right, when really, we are just deeply hurt. Antonio was not a bad man. He had simply forgotten how to breathe, how to smile, how to soften. He carried a deep sadness that he never dared name. And so, like many of us, he fought the world, when all along, the war was inside. Antonio's heart was not always a battlefield. Once, it had been soft, capable of laughter, of kindness, of dreaming about a life filled with warmth. But over the years, the small wounds of daily life had gone unattended. A harsh word here, a broken promise there. The disappointments piled up like stones in a sack, weighing him down slowly but surely. And when we carry too much for too long, something in us begins to harden. He did not mean to become distant from his wife, nor did he wish to be feared by his children. But anger, when it is not healed, becomes a shield, and then a sword. At first, it protects. Then, it wounds. It strikes out to defend the very heart it is slowly destroying. Each day, Antonio woke up already bracing for battle. His mind was quick to find offense. His words, sharpened by years of resentment, cut deeper than he realized. Even in silence, his presence carried tension, like a storm cloud hanging low above the rooftops. Those around him walked on eggshells, not because they wanted to hurt him, but because they did not know how to reach him anymore. And Antonio, he too, felt alone. He sat on his porch some evenings, staring at the ground with tired eyes. Inside, a quiet ache pulsed, not the kind of pain that screams, but the kind that stays, like a shadow under the ribs. He did not know how to ask for help. He wasn't even sure what was wrong, but he knew something wasn't right. He was angry at everything, and yet, if he were honest, he didn't even know why. This, dear listener, is the sorrow of an unexamined life, when the heart, forgotten and bruised, begins to turn against itself. Antonio was not an enemy of others. He was at war with his own reflection, his own regrets, his own longing to be different. Deep down, he wanted peace. But peace cannot enter where the door is closed by pride, fear, and pain. What Antonio didn't yet see was that healing never begins outside. It begins within, in the quiet courage to sit with your pain, to breathe through it, and to listen. The war in his heart was real, but so too was the path to peace. One afternoon, after a heated argument that left his home heavy with silence, Antonio stepped outside. He didn't say a word, didn't grab his coat, didn't tell anyone where he was going. He simply walked, away from the house, down the narrow dirt path that led toward the hills beyond the village. His heart was a storm, but his feet moved with a strange calm, as though something unseen was guiding him. The wind was soft, brushing past his face like a mother's forgotten touch. The fields stretched on, golden and quiet. For the first time in a long while, Antonio noticed the sound of birds, clear, light, as if they had always been singing just for him, but he had never listened. As he climbed a gentle slope shaded by trees, he saw a figure seated under a wide fig tree. The man was old, but not frail. His robe was plain, dusty from the road, and his sandals had clearly walked many miles, but what stood out most was his stillness. He wasn't doing anything, not reading, not praying, not speaking, just sitting, breathing, as if he and the tree had grown from the same soil. Antonio slowed, then stopped. There was something about this man that made the anger in his chest pause. The stranger didn't look up, but with a voice both gentle and clear, he said, "You carry a fire that burns you more than it warms others." Antonio blinked. He hadn't said a word. How could this stranger know? He felt irritation rise, his usual armor, but it melted quickly under the stranger's presence. There was no challenge in his tone, only compassion. And so, without quite knowing why, Antonio sat down a few feet away. "I'm tired," he muttered, not looking at the man. Silence followed. A silence so complete it wrapped around Antonio like a soft cloth. And in that silence, he felt something strange, safe. He began to speak, not with anger but with weariness, about how everything seemed wrong, how nothing he did brought him peace, how people always disappointed him, and how he always seemed to hurt the ones he loved the most. The words spilled out like water from a jar cracked too long ago. The man listened. That's all he did. No advice, no interruption. Just a quiet presence that invited the truth to come out. And when Antonio finally ran out of words, the stranger turned to him and asked a question so simple it stopped his breath. "If you knew you had only 7 days to live, what would you do differently?" Antonio's mind froze. His first instinct was to laugh it off, but something in the stranger's eyes said this was not a question to escape. It was an invitation, a mirror, a seed. The man stood, bowed his head gently, and continued walking, disappearing into the trees as quietly as he had appeared. Antonio remained where he was, alone, but no longer lost. The question echoed in his chest like a bell struck in a temple. 7 days, 7 days to live, not just differently, but more truly. And with that, something within him shifted. The stranger said little, but he had given Antonio something rare and precious. The beginning of awakening. As Antonio walked home, the sun was beginning to lower itself behind the hills, bathing the village in a golden hush. But in his chest, the question stirred like a drumbeat. If you had only 7 days to live, what would you do differently? It was a simple question, yet it didn't leave him. It followed him in silence, across the fields, past the trees, into the narrow roads of his village. He heard it not with his ears, but in the quiet of his being. It didn't accuse, didn't scold. It simply was. And its presence made everything around him feel different. He looked at the same children playing in the dust of the street, but now he saw their laughter as something precious, fleeting. He passed the same neighbor he usually avoided, and suddenly wondered why. He saw the clothes hanging to dry in the breeze, the scent of evening fires rising, the soft murmur of families preparing for supper. Everything felt quieter, more alive. As he reached his door, his footsteps slowed. Normally he would enter with a heavy sigh, ready for confrontation or complaint. But today he paused. Inside, his wife was setting the table. His children were speaking, softly, unaware of his presence, and something inside him softened. He stepped in, but instead of grumbling about something out of place, he simply said, "I need to apologize." The room fell still. His wife looked at him, half expecting sarcasm, but there was none, just his gaze, open and honest. He walked over, gently took her hand, and said, "I've been wrong. With you, with the kids. I've been wasting time on things that don't matter, and if I don't change now, I might never get the chance." There were no tears, no grand speeches, just a quiet truth offered humbly. Later that evening, he sat alone by the window. The stars had begun to appear, small lights on a vast canvas. And the question was still there, not haunting him now, but guiding him. What if this day was one of your last? Did you live it with love? Did you speak with kindness? Did you see the beauty around you? Or did you rush past it all? He didn't have answers yet. But for the first time in years, Antonio felt like he was beginning to ask the right questions. The stranger's words had not changed the world outside, but they had shifted something deep within, and from that shift, a new path was quietly unfolding. Not a path of dramatic change or heroic deeds, but of small, meaningful moments. Moments he had overlooked. Moments he would now begin to honor, one breath at a time. The next morning, Antonio woke before the sun. There was no alarm clock, no urgent reason, just a quiet stirring inside, as if his soul itself had asked to rise early. He sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the silence that wrapped the house like a soft blanket. His breath was steady. For the first time in a long time, there was no weight on his chest. As he opened the window, a cool breeze touched his face. The village still slept. The sky was pale with the promise of light, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Antonio stood still for a moment, not rushing, not planning, just being. Downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes and the smell of tea signaled that his wife had woken too. He entered the kitchen quietly. Their eyes met. She waited, uncertain. But instead of criticism, Antonio smiled and said, "Good morning," not just as a habit, but as a sincere offering. She gave a slight nod, surprised. And then, something rare. A small smile appeared on her lips. At the breakfast table, his children were chatting about their day ahead. Normally, Antonio would interrupt, point out their posture, complain about the noise. But this morning he simply listened, not to correct, but to understand. And when the youngest spilled a bit of milk, Antonio reached for the cloth without a word. No blame, just care. His wife looked at him again, this time with curiosity. After breakfast, he left for work. The walk to his workshop was familiar, yet everything looked different. The trees, the stone path, the birds calling from the rooftops, they had always been there, but today they felt more vivid. As if life itself had slowed down so he could finally see it. At the workshop, one of his coworkers made a mistake, a minor one, but one that usually sparked Antonio's fury. Today, he paused, then said calmly, "It's okay, let's fix it together." The coworker blinked, confused at first, then nodded, a little more at ease. That day, Antonio didn't move mountains. He didn't give a speech. He didn't suddenly become someone else. But he began walking in a different rhythm, a slower, gentler one. And this is where true transformation begins, not with a shout, but with a whisper, not with a grand gesture, but with a small choice to respond differently, to soften, to breathe, to try. And so, Antonio's 7 days didn't begin with fireworks, but with tea, a quiet smile, a helping hand, and a breath of fresh morning air. And sometimes, a gentle start is all we need to begin again. As the days passed, Antonio began to notice something he had never seen before. The weight of his past wasn't just behind him, it walked beside him, in the silence between words. In the lowered eyes of those he had once hurt, in the pauses that lingered longer than they should. And one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the village in gold, Antonio felt a stirring in his chest, not of anger, but of courage. The courage not to fight, but to face. He knew where he had to go first. It was the home of Marcos, an old friend. Once they had shared laughter, long walks, and deep talks under the stars. But pride had broken that bond. A harsh word, a refusal to apologize, a wound that had never healed. And over time, they became strangers who lived only a few doors apart. Antonio stood outside Marcos's house for several minutes, his feet rooted to the ground, his heart racing. He knocked. The door creaked open. Marcos looked up, surprised. His eyes narrowed slightly. But before he could speak, Antonio said, simply and sincerely, "I was wrong." He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He let the words stand, fragile and open. Marcos blinked. The silence was thick. Then slowly, something softened in his face. He nodded, stepped aside and said, "Come in." They didn't talk much about the past, just enough. What mattered more was the quiet laughter that returned like an old friend. And when Antonio left, his heart felt lighter, as if he had set down a stone he didn't know he was carrying. From that day on, Antonio visited others too. He greeted the shopkeeper he once yelled at during a hot, angry summer. He helped the neighbor he had blamed for noise that wasn't theirs. He sat with his cousin, estranged for years over a small dispute, and shared a simple meal without the burden of old pride. He did not expect anything in return. No apologies, no forgiveness, no redemption. He gave because it was time. Because the past only loses power when we stop running from it and begin to walk toward it with open hands. And with every step, every soft-spoken word, Antonio was not just healing relationships, he was healing himself. This was not about fixing everything, it was about beginning again. And sometimes, the most powerful way to begin again is with 3 words: I was wrong. When Antonio began to change, he didn't expect anyone to notice. He thought his small gestures, his softened voice, his apologies, his smile, would simply pass like wind through the trees. But what he didn't realize was that even the softest wind carries seeds. The village, once so accustomed to his heavy footsteps and harsh tone, began to sense something different in the air. Whispers stirred among the neighbors. Have you seen Antonio? He helped old Clara carry her firewood. He greeted me with a smile this morning. These weren't just words. They were astonished echoes of transformation. At work, the difference was even clearer. Antonio, who once barked at every minor mistake, now paused before speaking. Instead of criticism, he offered understanding. It's all right, he told a young apprentice who spilled paint on the workshop floor. I've done worse. The boy blinked in disbelief, expecting to be scolded. But instead, he smiled shyly. That smile would follow him all day. His co-workers began to relax around him. They spoke more freely, laughed a little louder, and even came to him, not out of fear, but out of respect. The tension that once filled the workshop like smoke slowly began to clear. At home, his children, once cautious and quiet, started to open up. They shared their stories from school, their small victories and disappointments. His wife, who had grown used to walking on eggshells, found herself laughing again. And Antonio, he just listened. Fully, patiently, gratefully. One evening, as he sat watching his family chat over dinner, he realized something profound. When we change our energy, we change the space around us. Like a stone dropped into still water, every small act of kindness, of patience, of presence, ripples outward. The angry man was fading, and in his place stood a man learning to love without shouting, to lead without controlling, to live without burning everything around him. And as the village watched him, something else began to happen. They started changing too. People smiled more often. Neighbors helped each other with chores. Even old arguments between villagers began to soften, if only a little. Antonio had not just healed his heart. He had awakened something forgotten in others, the quiet power of gentleness. And that, dear listener, is the true miracle of transformation. Not just how it changes you, but how it changes the world around you. By the 6th day, Antonio was no longer the same man who had once slammed doors and raised his voice like a weapon. Something inside him had softened, ripened, matured, like fruit left in the sun. Yet he didn't notice the full depth of the change until that morning, when he stepped out into the market street and saw it reflected in the eyes of others. A gentle breeze passed through the village as Antonio walked with quiet steps, nodding at familiar faces. But something was different. Where before people had turned away or lowered their heads, now they returned his gaze. A baker waved with flower-streaked hands. A child called his name. Even Senora Pilar, the elderly woman who used to cross the street to avoid him, offered a timid smile. And Antonio, he smiled back, naturally. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He hadn't given money or made speeches. He had simply chosen to live each day with more care, more awareness. And that choice had begun to shape the space around him like ripples in a still pond. He passed by Doña Clara's house and noticed her struggling with a basket of fruit. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, took the basket and said, "Let me help." She blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Antonio. I didn't expect that." Neither did he, but the gesture had already become part of him. It wasn't a performance. It was who he was becoming. Later that afternoon, at home, he found his wife humming while she cooked. His children were drawing on the floor, laughter filling the air. For a moment, Antonio stood at the doorway and watched them. Really watched them, noticing the little things, the way his daughter tilted her head while she sketched, how his son tapped his pencil rhythmically, how his wife tucked her hair behind her ear. These tiny details had always been there, but he had never slowed down enough to see them. He stepped inside, enjoying them without words, just his presence. And somehow, that was enough. His wife looked up and smiled. She didn't ask where he had been. She didn't mention the past. She simply reached for his hand under the table and gave it a gentle squeeze. Later that evening, as they sat outside watching the last light fade behind the hills, Antonio whispered, "I spent so much time chasing the wrong things. But now, just being here with you, it feels like everything I was searching for. His wife rested her head on his shoulder, the children played nearby, and in that quiet moment, Antonio felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not because the world had changed, but because he had. This was the gift of the sixth day. Not a grand revelation, but the realization that life is made of simple things. A shared smile, a soft hand, a peaceful meal, the sound of your own breath, finally in rhythm with the world. And so as the stars began to appear above, Antonio leaned back and gave thanks, not for wealth, not for success, but for the chance to live a single day with his eyes and heart wide open. On the seventh day, Antonio rose with a calm unlike anything he had known before. The sun was already climbing, casting a golden glow over the rooftops of the village. The sky was clear, the birds were singing, and the world, it seemed, was in perfect harmony. But inside Antonio, something even more profound stirred. A sense of completeness, as though a long and weary journey had finally found its resting place. He took his time dressing, breathing deeply as he tied his shoes and opened the window to let in the morning air. There was no rush, no anger, no shadow of urgency, just presence. A quiet awareness of being here, now. After breakfast, he made his way up the familiar dirt path that led to the small temple on the hill, the same path he had wandered in frustration just 7 days ago. But today, he climbed not to escape, but to understand. He felt a pull in his chest, not of guilt, but of gratitude. The monk was there, sweeping the temple grounds, just as he had been the first time. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if every gesture held meaning. He didn't look up when Antonio arrived, but spoke softly. "You've returned." Antonio bowed gently. "I had to. I needed to thank you." The monk placed the broom aside and turned to face him, his eyes filled with warmth and light. "So what did you discover in these 7 days?" Antonio sat down on a low stone step, hands resting on his knees. He looked out over the valley and exhaled slowly. "I found out that I've been wasting my life," he said. "Not because of others, not because of fate, but because I refused to see clearly. I let my anger take root, and it blinded me to what I already had." The monk nodded, silent. "I thought your words were a curse," Antonio continued, "but they were a gift. You gave me 7 days, not to die, but to begin living." There was a pause, filled only by the breeze that passed between them. Then the monk spoke, his voice softer now, like a whisper carried by the wind. "Antonio, I must tell you the truth. You were never dying. I never said you had 7 days to live in a literal sense. It was a parable, an invitation. A wake-up call to your soul." Antonio looked up, surprised but not angry. He didn't feel deceived. He felt seen, understood. He let the words sink in. "Nobody knows how much time they have," the monk continued. "But when we believe that our days are limited, we start to see clearly. We stop delaying forgiveness. We begin to speak kindly. We cherish the people in front of us. That urgency awakens the heart." Antonio smiled, not with his lips alone, but with his entire being. A deep, slow smile that came from knowing, not just understanding, the lesson. "So I wasn't dying," he said, "but I was asleep." The monk smiled back. "Exactly." Together, they sat in silence again, not the silence of awkwardness, but the sacred kind, the kind that says everything that needs to be said. Antonio didn't need more advice. He had lived the teaching. The truth had been revealed not through words, but through action, through breath, through presence. And in that moment, Antonio knew he had been given a second life. Dear listener, if today were your last day, how would you live it? Would you rush through it in anger? Would you spend it arguing, worrying, regretting? Or would you look around, take a deep breath, and realize the extraordinary beauty of simply being alive? This is the quiet teaching hidden within Antonio's story. Not a lesson carved in stone, but one whispered gently to the heart. Life is not measured by how long we live, but by how deeply we love and how sincerely we live. For many of us, life becomes a routine. We wait for the right time to apologize. We wait for tomorrow to say, "I love you." We wait for the perfect moment to start living fully. But the truth is, there is no perfect moment. There is only this one, this breath, this heartbeat. What Antonio found in his 7 days was not a countdown to death, but an invitation to awaken, to let go of the burden of pride, to forgive before it's too late, to speak kindly not because we have to, but because we can. And in doing so, he discovered the joy that had always been available to him, the joy of presence, of connection, of simply being with those we love. You see, when we live as if we only have a few days left, our senses open, our eyes become tender, we listen more, we speak less. We become mindful of the small things, the laughter of a child, the warmth of morning tea, the comfort of a shared silence. The Buddha once taught, "The trouble is, you think you have time. And yet time is the most uncertain gift. We cannot hold it. We cannot demand more of it. But we can honor it. We can bow to it by using it wisely, with compassion, with patience, with courage." So let this be your moment of turning. Ask yourself gently, what am I holding on to that I could release? Who could I forgive today? How can I show love before the sun sets? Because in the end, we are not remembered for the things we own or the victories we win. We are remembered for how we made others feel, for the peace we brought into a room, for the healing we offered with our words and actions. Antonio's transformation wasn't magic. It was simply the power of awareness, a shift from reacting to responding, from surviving to embracing, from hurting to healing. And you too, dear one, carry that same seed of awakening inside you. So go now, not with fear, but with softness in your step, with presence in your breath, with kindness in your voice. Live today as if it were your last, not with sadness, but with love. Let that love guide your choices, illuminate your path, and touch the lives around you. In this way, no day is wasted. In this way, we become truly alive. Thank you for listening. May peace fill your heart, and may the light of awareness guide your every step.